All right, good evening, and thank you for joining us. We're having a very interesting conversation today. We're talking about the standoff between Twitter and the government of India. It's fundamentally to do with freedom of speech. Now, you'll remember that after the chaos and the vandalism at Red Fort on the 26th of January, the government had asked Twitter to block a certain number of accounts, and Twitter had done so. There were 250 accounts, including the Caravan India, a couple of activists, a couple of journalists, and Prasar Bharati CEO Shashi Shekhar. Now, post that, we understand that Twitter unblocked these accounts after about 12 hours, right? Now, since then, the Ministry of Electronics, Information and Technology has sent Twitter a separate notice for non-compliance because Twitter allowed these accounts to come back on. Twitter has now released a blog on which it says very clearly that they've taken certain steps in compliance, but not all of the steps they believe follow the Indian law of freedom of expression. Now, according to Twitter, they have reduced the visibility of the hashtags that they believe had harmful content, that they've taken a range of enforcement actions, including permanent suspension in some cases. But they've also said that we've not taken action on accounts that consist of news media entities, journalists, activists, and politicians. To do so, we believe would violate the fundamental right and free expression under Indian law. Now, here's the thing, right? This actually brings us to a much bigger question. The question of freedom of speech in our country. The government had in its notice, according to the Indian Express and a couple of other newspapers, pointed out to Twitter that it is just an intermediary. It cannot apply its own mind to decide what is okay content and what is not, as far as the exceptions of the freedom of speech in our country is concerned, and Section 69A of the IT Act, which is an extension of that freedom of speech, which allows the government to take down content from the internet if it's in violation of those exceptions. And I'll go through the exceptions in a second, right? Twitter argues that, listen, we will take down the offending statement or the hashtag or someone who's repeatedly violating our rules, our platform rules. But to block accounts entirely goes against the Indian laws of freedom of expression. So who decides whether something is okay or not okay? Is it Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, as we are on right now? Is it Instagram? Is it the government of India? Are these platforms to comply when the government sends them notices? We also know that the punishment for the Twitter executives for non-compliance could either be a fine or jail time. So this is serious. This is not something to be taken very lightly. Now, from the government's point of view, if you look at it from the government's point of view, the government believes that the 1,178 accounts that it has asked Twitter to suspend immediately were spreading misinformation about the farmer protests and provocative content, and they were a risk to the safety in our country. Now, if the government believes that there's someone who is a risk to the country, is the government within its rights to take down that content from the internet? And should Twitter be compliant or non-compliant? Now, these are the questions that we're going to ask this evening. To help us answer those questions, Mr. Sanjay Hegde, who's a senior advocate with the Supreme Court, I'm hoping we'll answer the questions about the fundamental rights of speech and expression. Mr. Pawan Duggal is an advocate who specializes in the field of cyber law. And I want really Mr. Duggal to give us a perspective of the internet and where these intermediaries come in and the role of an intermediary or a platform like a Twitter or a Facebook, because 69A of the IT Act very clearly gives the power to issue directions of blocking from public access information of any computer resource. I must remind our audience that these laws were written as of today 21 years ago. So our IT laws are fairly outdated. It still says things like computer resource. But let's just figure out how these laws are implemented in our country. Mr. Hegde, to start with you first. Do you believe that Twitter has the rights as an intermediary or a platform to sort of apply itself and decide what goes and what doesn't go, on what follows the law and what doesn't follow the law? Or should they be following the instructions of the government clearly right now?
Well, obviously, I do not believe that Twitter has that right to decide that what goes or what doesn't go, because Twitter took down my account and I took them to court. The matter is pending in the Delhi High Court. And I do hope that some good law is laid down, because the contours of freedom of speech, when it is in the hands of a private corporation, which effectively controls the public square and the marketplace of ideas, does it have the sole right? I'm not speaking of Twitter only, Twitter, Facebook, Google, 4 or 5 corporations today control most of this of free speech or user content on the internet.
Mm.
Are they the new East India Company of free speech? And will their board of directors decide it? I say no. I say that it should be on questions of freedom of speech, which is a constitutionally guaranteed right. The constitutional courts have to step in. I don't say that the government is the sole arbiter of free speech. There has to be somebody outside, both the corporation as well as the government, and that necessarily has to be the constitutional court. That's the position that I have taken in my writ petition before the Delhi High Court, which had issued notice. Unfortunately, we could not have a hearing during this COVID period, primarily because it's not a matter of life and death, but it is going to be a very important matter when it finally comes to be argued out in detail.
But Mr. Hegde, what you're hoping for is that the Constitutional Court sets down guidelines that everybody has to follow, the government and platforms like Twitter. Is that what you're saying?
Not only that the Constitutional Court delimits the areas, the powers, and the responsibilities. Right now, it's a question of power. Twitter or any of these platforms say, look, we are private platforms. We decide who says, who gets to be on our platform. We decide if any post violates our rules. And we also decide that if the government tells us to take down something, is the government compliant with its own laws? Essentially, all these platforms tend to say that, look, if you want to be on our platform, you have to obey what we say, and you have to go by what we say. I say no. I say that when you are monetizing free speech, you also perform a public function, and free speech is a constitutionally guaranteed right, and the constitutional courts, which interpret the Constitution, have to step in. When the court finally gives a verdict, it would delineate the roles of the government as well as that of the platform, and probably let's see whether we can get some mechanism outside both of these to regulate on a day-to-day basis.
Mr. Duggal, where do you stand on the same matter? Because here's my question. Now, let's assume that Twitter is also the organization that took down the accounts of President Donald Trump when he was the sitting president of the United States. So here is an organization that these 3 powerhouses between Google, Facebook, and Twitter, they shut off access to the most powerful man in the world. Somehow, they are in some ways more powerful than heads of states, and they're able to make those decisions. Now, where does that leave the Indian citizen? Is it right for the government to ask for accounts to be taken down? Is it right for Twitter to say no? Where does the law stand in the middle of all of this?
The law here is very clear. Number one, the Indian cyber law is applicable to any service provider, whether they are physically located in India or not, so long as their services are available on computers and mobiles located in India. That being so, once the Indian law applies to you, under the Indian law, the Indian Information Technology Act 2000 is a special legislation. Section 81 of the IT Act says that the provisions of the Indian cyber law prevail over anything inconsistent therewith contained in any other law for the time being in force. Having said that, all these service providers are ultimately intermediaries under Section 21W of the IT Act. Section 79 of the IT Act mandates these service providers to exercise due diligence while discharging their obligations under the law. Now, due diligence parameters have been defined under the Information Technology Intermediary Guidelines Rules 2011, where the intermediaries are mandated to and are bound to comply with the IT Act and rules and regulations made thereunder. So once you are an intermediary, you are also governed by the Supreme Court judgment in the case of Shreya Singhal versus Union of India, where the Supreme Court has said that if you're an intermediary, just be a mere spectator. Do not act as a judge. Wait on as you get lakhs of requests to remove or disable content. Wait on either from an order from a government agency or from a court of law, and only then you start acting. Now, once the legal landscape is crystal clear, the law does not really give any kind of an elbow room to the intermediary to go ahead and sit on judgment on any governmental order passed or even an order passed by court of law. In case if Twitter is aggrieved by any blocking order under Section 69A of the IT Act, then clearly it has got the remedy of filing an appeal against the said order under the Information Technology Act. Clearly it has the ability to go ahead and even go to the writ jurisdiction of the High Courts and the Supreme Court. But it cannot say that I'm going to act on judgment of the High Court order or of the governmental order, and that I will pick and choose what I'm going to actually agree on, comply with versus what I'm not, on the ground that it is violative of freedom of speech and expression. As Mr. Hegde rightly says, it's a constitutional court which has to decide. These are constitutional matters, and therefore it's only the only guiding principle will be the Constitution of India, not any foreign company, not the board of directors of any foreign company. And if they're doing so, they have to be mentally prepared that any intermediary who does not comply with Indian cyber law has to face three kinds of potential consequences. Number one, it loses its statutory exemption from legal liability, which is a safe harbor that's provided under Section 79 of the IT Act. Number two, if it does not voluntarily comply with any of the blocking orders given by the government, then under Section 69A3 of the IT Act, a criminal action can be taken because it's an offense punishable with 7 years imprisonment and fine against the top management and the officers of the intermediary. And number three, the intermediary can also be exposed to damages by way of compensation. Now, clearly, this is a confrontation that's come up, and it's only best in the best fitness of things that the matter be decided by the courts. I think the time has come where the Lakshman Rekha needs to be drawn. Intermediaries are very powerful, but they cannot sit on judgment on the Constitution of India, nor on the legal infrastructures here. So it'll be a very good, interesting issue to actually be adjudicated by the courts in the coming times.
So here's the thing, and that's a very interesting stand, because technically freedom of speech and expression and Article 69, Section 69A of the IT Act have the same list of exceptions, right? The right of freedom is not absolute, and the government can frame laws of restrictions when it is not in the interest of the sovereignty and integrity of India, security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency, morality, contempt of court, defamation, incitement of offense. This is largely what the IT Act says as well. Now, in real time, and Mr. Hegde, brought in a very real example, so I'll take the question to Mr. Hegde. In real time, someone's put up a tweet. Let's say, for argument's sake, there's a question about whether this tweet is a violation of these exceptions that we have listed out. Should Twitter take it down immediately? Should Twitter take down the entire profile? Because by the time the court makes a decision, it's going to be a while. So does this person stay off the platform? Who makes that decision, Mr. Hegde?
According to Twitter, it makes the decision. It decides whether to take off the tweet. It decides whether to take off the handle itself. So there is an appellate authority within Twitter. Very often, this kind of policing is done by AI bots. If the algorithm catches something which could possibly be in violation, sometimes the tweet is taken off or blocked for viewing within the country. And then thereafter, if an appeal is filed, a human somewhere looks at it and then decides. Now, the question is that Twitter insists that this process is final. There is the other part of it where governments can say, look, there is this content which is likely to cause problems. It could cause riots. It could cause violence. Therefore, take it off. In those circumstances, Twitter normally takes it off. Now, the question that Twitter has to answer for itself in one sense, and Twitter is also regulating itself on where it regulates others' free speech. If Twitter gets the feeling that the government is not is using these exceptions in order to curb somebody's free speech, then where does Twitter stand? Does Twitter tell the government, no, look, I think you are wrong? And does Twitter get to actually decide on it and say, okay, fine. If you do not like it, we might very well switch off India as a whole. Instead of a single tweet in India or a single account in India, supposing we decide that we walk off India altogether.
But that seems unlikely, Mr. Hegde, given the fact that this is a private organization for which India is a very large market.
It may well be, because you see, companies abroad do take their internal ethics and their internal standards very seriously. Twitter's chief legal officer is of Indian origin, Vijay Hegde. In fact, even earlier, when it was spoken of the likelihood that Trump's account could one day be banned, the decision would have been, people said that the decision maker was most likely to be Vijay. Now, Trump's account got banned at a particular point of time when violence ensued. And once Twitter took the lead, the other private corporations who act as the gatekeepers of free speech also followed suit. If the Indian government pushes too far, I would not be surprised. I really would not be surprised if they say, okay, you can build your own Chinese firewall, build your own Weibo, but maybe it's not worth doing business in India. Now, could India necessarily take take that kind of message? Because it would speak volumes then for the ease of doing business and a lot of other things. So right now, it does appear to me that both the government and Twitter are in a extensive game of chicken. You know what chicken is, where two people drive their cars at each other.
Yes.
And the person who swerves, the other guy gets to say, chicken, you were chicken. So they right now, this is what it reminds me of.
Sure. There's someone in the chat who keeps asking what book is Faye reading. I was referring to the Constitution of India on the freedom of speech and expression. That's the book that I'm holding up, or that's the book that's on my table right now. But the valid question that must be asked is the government, so obviously it is the government's responsibility to keep an eye on on certain elements that might be causing trouble in society, that might be inciting violence and causing riots and things like that. But given the fact that we currently have a government that views everybody that protests as Andolanjeevis and views those Andolanjeevis as detrimental to progress and perhaps termites or parasites to progress, is it possible that the power that the government has could also be used to overreach and be vindictive against those who are questioning it? Mr. Duggal?
Clearly, the power is massive. The power can be used in a variety of senses. And the reason for this is very simple. The broad ambit of the language used under Section 69A is so broad, wide, and comprehensive that it's possible that almost any kind of a circumstance under the sun could be brought under the same. When we talk of parameters like sovereignty, security, integrity of India, defense of India, friendly relations with other nations, public order, decency, morality, or to prevent the commission of any cognizable offense, there are no set golden principles as to what specifically is going to come in as an integral component thereof. Now, therefore, I think given this kind of massive power that exists in the hands of the government, and given the fact that the blocking rules of 2009 do not really give adequate checks and balances, I think now in 2021, the time has come for us to revisit the entire issue. On a personal note, I believe that blocking is an outdated phenomenon. It's like a 19th century mindset trying to deal with the 21st century problem. But having said that, today blocking actually attracts far more attention and traffic to the blocked account or the handle rather than the country. So clearly, there's a need for more transparency, there's a need for more accountability, and there needs to be more checks and balances so that the huge powers that have been granted under the IT Act are not potentially abused or misused at an appropriate period of time. Clearly, the last time the Supreme Court revisited this entire scenario was March 2015, when the Shreya Singhal versus Union of India judgment came across. Since then, a lot of water has flown down the bridge. It's time that we need to go ahead and give it crystal clear illustrations of what all kind of categories or circumstances could come under these broad ambits. Now, just because somebody is using a Twitter handle to use a particular hashtag for either purposes of supporting or for purposes of, shall I say, criticizing the said movement, if the entire tweet and the handle is going to be blocked, then somewhere down the line, the affected parties' fundamental rights could also be impacted. So it could open up a Pandora's box of litigation. Therefore, there's need for more clarity, and hence it would be best if the government itself revises and reviews the entire process and makes more accountability and transparency space therein.
Well, of course, like I said at the beginning, these were laws that were written now 21 years ago, and they're in desperate need of updating. But one also wonders if the government would be completely fair in updating these laws, given that so much happens on Twitter right now. Mr. Hegde, Thomas John asks a question. He says, TV channels and newspapers, for example, won't allow any statement that they feel is inappropriate. And that is a judgment that is made internally by that platform. So why should Twitter be different?
The nature of the medium itself is different.
Okay.
Now, I can't come on a TV channel unless the channel invites me.
Yes.
And then when it invites me, it also sometimes tends to mute my mic if it is a particular channel which doesn't like what I say. I then have a choice of going or not going. But Twitter is a different medium where it is technically open to all. You start conversing in the public square, and then if you violate some rules, Twitter may take action against the tweet or the person tweeting. That is how it operates. Equally, the government and the law can hold you responsible for your tweets. Very often somebody tweets something sitting in Delhi, and then there is a complaint filed in outer Manipur or someplace like that. So it is not as if the law is totally powerless there. Speaking on a TV channel, writing in a newspaper, stand fundamentally on a different plane than what happens in social media, which is much more immediate. And social media, which monetizes everybody's immediate thoughts and immediate ideas. So the standards necessarily have to be different.
So here's the question at the end of the day, right? So now as a citizen, a lot of us use Twitter, Facebook. I use YouTube simply to be able to reach people, to be able to communicate with people. Do we now live in a world where the government can send notices to any of these people and have citizens taken down?
Is that for Pawan?
For you, Mr. Hegde, I'm sorry, I should have said so.
Yeah. So the government can take that step of blocking my account or your account, but then that government can very certainly be taken to a constitutional court, because that government is bound by the Constitution of India.
Yes.
Now, Twitter or YouTube or any of them, they say we are private entities, we are private companies, our rules are private, and you don't like our platform or our policy or what we did to you, you can very well go off it, you can go to another platform, create your own platform. My company, my rules is the argument on the side of these purveyors of free speech, to which the answer is that free speech is something far too important to be left totally in private hands.
Yes.
It has to be regulated in accordance with constitutional values. And if there is an independent regulator outside the system of both the corporation and the government, then that would possibly adhere to constitutional values. If not, the constitutional courts have to directly step in.
Yes. So basically, this decision cannot be left either entirely in the hands of the executives at Twitter, nor can it be left entirely in the hands of the government of India or any state. There has to be a constitutional court or a regulator mandated by the courts to moderate or to find a way in between. Mr. Duggal, last question to you. Now that Twitter has to some extent turned around and said we are not going to comply, what happens next as per the law?
As per the law, the government can start criminal prosecution under Section 69A3 by filing an FIR, and let the process of law take on its course. The government has also the choice of potentially blocking out Twitter as a platform from within India. And the government can take various steps, including to ensure that Twitter does not earn from the market of India because it's not complying with Indian law. More significantly, the bigger message that goes out to the intermediary ecosystem is very strong. That look, in case if you are now not going to comply with the law, be prepared that we are going to strip you of your statutory exemption from legal liability under Section 79 of the IT Act, and then law will potentially take your own course, which is something that's going to put these intermediaries in a very uncomfortable position, because the majority of these intermediaries are American companies and are governed by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which in the US gives them roughly similar kind of immunities that are available in India. Of course, the Indian approach is more nuanced, but I think the wake-up call is also now for the Indian government. You will now have to quickly start reviewing and revisiting your soft glove approach towards intermediary as a whole. Now, gone are the days where you can actually keep them in reverence. The time is to give them a strong message that, look, if you have to operate in India, you will have to comply with Indian law. You cannot be mute spectator while mayhem happens on your network. And finally, if you're aggrieved by anything which the government does or anybody else does, please feel free to move to the courts of the country. But don't come back with a message that, look, we will decide in judgment about the either correctness or the extent to which we are going to be going at and complying with their respective orders. So I think a big message is what's awaited. But I think at this juncture, all eyes are now on the government. If the government blinks, it could potentially have a disastrous impact. But if the government comes up with a very strong response, then I think it could change the ecosystem and for a long period of time, the way how intermediaries are going to operate in India.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you so much for answering those questions. But we'll be tracking this very, very closely. And I'll tell you why, viewers, because this will have far-reaching impact on everything. I mean, we go about our day without realizing the impact that social media and the internet has on our lives. It is a direct extension of our freedom of speech and expression. It is an extension of what we can and cannot say. And how this finally settles and lands will perhaps also weigh on your mind the next time you pick up your phone to tweet something. So we're going to track this really closely for you and bring you updates. Mr. Hegde, thank you for joining us as well. And good luck with the case that you have before the courts on the same matter. And we will bring you that update also. For our audience, we're going to go off now, but we'll come back with an AMA in 5 minutes where we can just have a conversation about everything that's happening. So stay with us, an AMA in about 5 minutes. But for now, thanks for watching.